Tonight on Talking Politics, it has been a refrain of sorts for many lately. Yet another welcome week in which COVID numbers are down and life is getting a bit closer to the way it was pre-pandemic. But some things haven't reverted to the way they used to be, including how many Massachusetts residents work. At countless white-collar jobs, remote or hybrid work seems to be here to stay. That's left urban hubs like Boston far less busy than they used to be, wreaking havoc on many businesses and in some quarters, prompting calls for elected officials to swoop in and save city life as we used to know it. But is that their job? And is the end goal really what we want? We'll dig into those questions later with business columnist Shirley Leung of the Boston Globe and Monica Tibbits-Nutt, the executive director of the 128 Business Council. But first, there's been another big change from 2020 to now. The cost of living is a lot higher, with the price of gasoline leading the way. It's gone from less than $2 a gallon at the start of the pandemic to more than $4.30 a gallon on average in Massachusetts, according to AAA. Yet recent calls from two Republican candidates for governor and some GOP legislators to temporarily suspend the state's 24-cent a gallon gas tax seem to be dead on arrival on Beacon Hill, with House Speaker Ron Mariano describing the idea as a stunt. So why is a temporary gas tax cut a non-starter? And what other steps are the legislature and governor considering to get financial relief to Massachusetts residents? Joining me to tackle that topic and the other political headlines of the week are GBH News' City Hall reporter Saraya Wintersmith and our State House correspondent Mike Deehan. Thank you both for being here. Mike, you are the State House expert. Why was this idea of temporarily suspending the gas tax dead on arrival on Beacon Hill?
Well, the reason that Democrats and Republican Governor Charlie Baker kind of dismissed this idea, and you mentioned that Mariano called it a stunt, is because of those revenues that would come in are already spent, more or less. A lot of that gas tax money goes towards roads and bridge projects, things like that. That has a lot to do with how we borrow money to fund those things. It really boils down to the state's bond rating. And the credit agencies, just like you and I have credit scores, the state has a bond rating that's essentially a credit score. If we forego the revenue from that gas tax, really for any reason, temporary or not, that means that we might have a harder time paying back our bills, paying our loans, and it would really screw up how the state borrows money. The other side of it is that 24 cents a gallon wouldn't necessarily help people out as much as other people say when we're talking about dollars and dollars of increases on a gallon of gas.
It is something of a drop in the bucket, as much as I hate filling up at the current price point. Are there other ideas that are viable on Beacon Hill that could provide financial relief to Massachusetts residents?
Well, if you ask Governor Charlie Baker, he'll tell you that he's got a great $700 million tax break plan built into his budget proposal for the coming year, the coming fiscal year. That's going to be an across-the-board tax cut in all sorts of different ways. Tax credits for senior homeowners, for families, for the poorest Massachusetts residents, and a pretty good tax break for the richest Massachusetts residents in the form of an estate tax reform that would save millionaires a lot when they pass on those estates when they die. That is considered a way to keep snowbirds essentially in Massachusetts instead of moving those estates to another state. Baker and a lot of Democratic budget writers will tell you that that is really the key to helping out Massachusetts residents' pocketbooks rather than something like a gas tax fix.
Saraya Wintersmith, let's hop to Boston City Hall. Mayor Michelle Wu has proposed an ordinance or filed an ordinance that would ban targeted residential protests between the hours of 9 p.m. and 9 a.m. She, of course, has been experiencing those for months now. But the city council recently seemed to give sort of a lukewarm response to her idea. Who has concerns about this and why?
Sure. I think even though this proposal is aimed at those protests that she's been experiencing, the mayor and her neighbors, the proposal doesn't say that this is specifically about Mayor Michelle Wu's house. It can't. The way that we regulate free speech rules wouldn't allow for it. And so the councilors know that this would apply more broadly. So there are three big things that I heard in the hearing. One, free speech, though not unregulated, is sacred. Is Mayor Wu's plight right now enough to tamper with free speech rules in the city? And if so, what precedent does the city set? Secondly, Sorry, I froze.
No, it's totally fine. So free speech, sacrosanct, even though there are limits placed on it. The other thing that I recall hearing, and I wasn't in the building like you, is concern that it might be applied to protests that it shouldn't be applied to. For example, Black Lives Matter protests. I believe, remind me, which of the counselors said, this is a way that we've made progress through protests that makes people uncomfortable. I'm blanking on the counselor's name now. It's my turn.
Kendra Lara
Thank
was
you.
one of the folks who was raising concerns about BLM protesters and how they would be affected. They were in front of Marty Walsh's house over Boston's 2024 Olympic bid. The third big thing is that Boston and the state already have rules around noise and disturbance of the peace. The counselors were concerned about why those rules are not being enforced right now.
Do you think that ultimately the council is going to reject this, or are there enough people who are at least comfortable with the idea that this ordinance is going to kick in after 60 days, whether it's approved or just not acted on?
There are 5 who have expressed support, saying that they believe it is reasonable and that it would pass constitutional muster if the city were to be sued over it, which people have threatened to do. But there is a working session coming up where they may tweak the proposal. They're expected to pose questions to the city's police and law departments, and things could change.
Mike, back to Governor Baker in the State House. He dusted off a proposal that he'd first floated back in 2019 before the pandemic to significantly change the way health care is dispersed in Massachusetts. What does he want to do exactly?
Baker's big plan is to boost behavioral health care in Massachusetts. Like you said, it's something that he's been working on for years. The legislature is getting around to doing a big health care push this session at the end of their 2 years. That'll likely happen this spring, but we don't really know what it's going to look like. The Senate passed a very big behavioral health, mental health care bill that would do all sorts of things to increase the number of health care providers, mental health care providers, and things of that nature, as well as give equity to and parity to mental health care in the Commonwealth. Baker has a similar plan. He has similar goals. And so what he put out this week is really his attempt to influence that debate. We know the House and the Senate are going to do something. We don't know exactly where they're going to compromise. This is now Baker's push to say it needs to be mental health care. We need to get more providers. We need to pay them more. We really just need to pump money into the behavioral health sector to help build it up to meet the demand that is really going through the roof.
Tell me if I've got this right. My understanding is that he also wants more money spent by insurers, not just on behavioral health care, but on primary health care, basically making it less appealing for physicians to just go to high-end professions where they make a ton of money in reimbursements down the road, making it more appealing for people to work in primary care or behavioral care, which tend not to get a ton of money, and thereby keep people from ending up in ERs. Is that a fair broad brush characterization?
Yeah, that's exactly what Baker wants to do, and that is more of a maintenance type thing. If more people are going to their doctors regularly, seeing their primary care physicians frequently, then yeah, they'll probably end up in the hospital a lot less.
Okay, Saraya Wintersmith, my last question goes to you. You just did a great big piece at WGBHnews.org about the history of attempts to reform the Boston Police Department. Obviously, this is a priority for Mayor Michelle Wu. She was much more pro-reform than Anissa Essayah-George in last year's election. Are there any big takeaways from what the history has been that people should bear in mind as the Wu administration tries to get reform done moving forward?
This was a really fun piece to work on because when you go back and look at old reports, it just shows you how often our societies are confronting their same challenges later. 50 years ago, the city was in a similar place where the mayor wanted reform and tried to look for a commissioner to deliver that through a national search. Back in the day, there was a lot of racial and ethnic tension, and there were feelings about what it means to bring an outsider into Boston. In my interviews for this piece, I found that there are still concerns about the insider-outsider dynamic. And as far as racial tension, there is still a feeling that there are disproportionate promotional opportunities and disciplinary outcomes for officers of color. And for those folks who would like to see an insider, they also think it would be a great step if the city were to look within the department and pluck someone who might have been overlooked back in the day to make good on the reforms that Wu wants now.
That's a really interesting piece of the insider-outsider argument that had never occurred to me until your piece. Saraya Wintersmith, Mike Deehan, thank you as always. Good to talk to both of you.
Thanks, Al.
Next up, if you used to go to work in Boston Monday through Friday before the pandemic hit and you've swung by your office lately, you've probably noticed some changes. The streets aren't deserted exactly, but they don't bustle the way they used to. Also, it's entirely possible your favorite lunch spot is gone, replaced by a new business or maybe just an empty storefront. And the end of this wave of COVID seems unlikely to change that, because at many workplaces, many employees aren't eager to go back to the way things used to be, at least not yet. For the record, this reluctance isn't unique to Boston. A recent Pew Research Center survey found that 59% of Americans who can work from home are doing exactly that, all or most of the time. And that of that group, 61% are working from home because they choose to, not because their workplace is closed down. Recently, in his State of the Union speech, President Biden said it's time to kick that habit and get back to the office.
We have the tools we need. It's time for America to get back to work and fill our great downtowns again with people. People working from home can feel safe and begin to return to their offices.
But this week on GBH's Boston Public Radio, Mayor Michelle Wu stopped short of making a comparable plea.
We know that Boston is so many parts of our economy are ones that you can work remotely, and people are choosing to, even as cases have gone down, even as we're seeing a lot of progress in the pandemic. Cities are forever changed by this, and it's no longer enough to say if we just have a big company, then people will need to live nearby there, and that's how the city can try to have jobs. We truly need to lean on what makes Boston a place where people can't miss out except for being there in person. Arts, culture, restaurants, being together, celebrating communities.
All of which raises some big questions. Is it realistic to expect the rhythms of the work week to come back as COVID lifts? Should elected officials be pushing for that or trying to envision a new future that reflects the way we're living now? And if Americans heeded the president's call en masse, what would we gain and what would we lose? Joining me to talk it all through are Monica Tibbits-Nutt, the executive director of the 128 Business Council, and Shirley Leung, a business columnist and associate editor at the Boston Globe. Thank you both for being here. Shirley, I remember you writing a column right when Mayor Wu won that election last year, saying it's important that we push to get downtown somewhat back to the way it used to be, and Mayor Wu needs to take a leadership role here. Did you like what you heard in those comments that we played a moment ago, or would you like her to be saying things that she isn't saying right now?
You know, Mayor Wu is in a tough position. I mean, I think she's right. The workplace is forever changed, and that will forever change downtown. I think she is telling people and workers, come back downtown. I think they're gonna do some, welcome back to downtown days, and that will be necessary. But she also has to think about the future, that people are not going to be coming back at least for a while, for 5 days a week. They're going to maybe come back 2 days or 3 days, and what kind of impact that will have on downtown. And she has to think about what does the new downtown look like then?
Monica, what was your read on the mayor's comments? Did you have the same interpretation of them as Shirley, or do you have a different take?
I have the same interpretation. I think the part that I struggle with is, as we have had this new normal, it has honestly been very helpful for a lot of people and has really made the workplace a lot more equitable, where you have parents who are able to have more flexibility. You have those who have hidden disabilities, those who have other health implications. And so while I agree, the vibrance of our communities is incredibly important, we also need to be very, very careful in forcing people to go back to a work style that just didn't really work for them, and really understand the equitable concerns around that. So I'm urging balance in making sure that we are taking those populations into consideration, but also encouraging people to get out, go to the local businesses, start to put more people on the streets, and really get that vibrancy back. It just might be in a different way.
I should make sure here that I give each of you a chance to explicitly say what you'd like to see happen in, say, the duration of the next year. So Shirley, let's start with you. What is it, focusing on downtown Boston in particular, where the Globe is based and where a lot of people used to go to work before the pandemic, what do you now, at this point in history, want to see happen moving forward?
I mean, it's been a long 2 years and new habits have formed, and we've got to be realistic. We're starting to see the great return, right? Employers set formal return dates, but not everyone's going to come back immediately. People have schedules tied to their, kids that, and then the summer hits. So I'm thinking looking at the fall where we see a more new normal. And so I like to see people back, once a week, twice a week, 3 days a week. I mean, one thing I wanted to point out is that corporate America thrived when many of us worked from home. I was just talking to an economist who was telling me profits are up 20% through the third quarter of 2021. That's incredible. So I think employers also want to to be careful when they return to the office, because people have been productive. People have been been very good working from home. So I think, but I do feel like people should come back. They should be in person with their colleagues at some of the time.
And what is, and Monica, bear with me because I'll let you articulate your vision too, but Shirley, I want to make sure that I understand the rationale for what you would like to see happen. Why is it that in downtown Boston, it's important that most people come back most of the time? Is it because you think that offers benefits in the workplace that we don't get if we're working remotely? Is it because there are businesses that have taken a hit that are not going to be able to come back unless a lot of people come back to the office? Or is it maybe something else I haven't mentioned?
I don't know what the right number is. I don't know if it's 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. I don't know what the right number is, because I do think that, as Monica talked about, equity is important and balance is important. But, when you talk to people, you talk to employers, and not one person has said, Zoom is the best way to collaborate. I think ultimately, if we want to reach new heights, and I'm specifically talking about innovation, cure for cancer, finding the next vaccine, so some of that work has to be done in person. It can't be 100% work from home. So that's where I see the future. And it's probably going to take us months, if not, a year or two, to kind of figure out what is that right balance.
Okay, Monica Tibbits-Nutt, do you hope that, societally speaking, we get to the point that Shirley just described, or do you want to see us settle somewhere different?
I think the 1 to 2 days a week is reasonable. People miss each other. People are lonely. And I think there is a detriment to a lot of the interaction within offices, but also a detriment, especially to young professionals. They're not getting that interaction. They're not getting to actually spend time with their colleagues in these more informal settings. With that said, I do think, as I said, we really need to think about these populations. We ignored populations who are especially vulnerable, those with disabilities, for a very long time. And I think we have been more cognizant during the pandemic, but now I think as we're starting to think about going back, starting to think about getting out of the house more, having your workers come back, this still has to be very much so at the forefront of these conversations. I would love to see people back 1, 2 days, same as Shirley. I don't know exactly what that right balance is, but I want to make sure that these public places do not become places of exclusion. And so I'm very cautious in watching the numbers, but then also, like I said, really thinking about how is this going to impact all of the workforce and all of these different populations.
I genuinely do not want to be like a stereotypical cable news show host. We're not cable here, and foment disagreement where there isn't none. But if I'm hearing both of you correctly, it sounds to me like, Shirley, you see 1 to 2 days at the start, but maybe 3 or 4, or even in some cases 5 days moving forward. And Monica, it sounds to me like you envision more of a adherence to a hybrid model where the majority of days are not necessarily spent in the workplace a year from now. Am I right, or am I putting inaccurate words in your respective mouths there?
I mean, I don't see anyone talking about 5 days a week.
Okay.
And very rarely 4 days a week. It's really 3 days a week. I think Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is what people are talking about. But we don't. I think employers are also want to give space and time to their employees coming back to the office. I mean, some of them, think about some of them with unvaccinated children. They're still it's still a public health concern coming back into the office. So we're going to see a period period of it's going to be touch and go. And now, with this new subvariant, I mean, we could all be working from home again sooner than we think. But I want to talk about downtown. I didn't answer that part of the question. And, I think Mayor Wu is already seeing the writing on the wall that not everyone's going to come back. And so what do I do with a city where I have 20 to 30% less foot traffic? If people are staying home at least 2 days a week, what happens? What is the future of downtown? Do we fill those emptier office towers with housing? Do we fill the empty retail spaces with arts and culture or with other creative and diverse businesses to get people downtown, not for work, but for other reasons?
I'm glad that you mentioned a whole bunch of the things you did there. I do think people still forget about younger children who cannot get vaccinated. A lot of us who don't have kids who are that young have kind of just come to the conclusion that everyone can get it if they want it. And also, I'm holding my breath too to see what happens in 3 months or 6 months in terms of COVID. You mentioned some changes that are going to be inescapable. I want to quote something that the Baker administration highlighted in their big Future of Work report that they put out last year. They pointed out that there are going to be benefits to people not coming back that we might not think of right off the bat. Specifically, they said lower prices due to reduced demand, this is in Boston and Cambridge, will likely encourage mid-sized businesses to lease previously unaffordable real estate in Boston and Cambridge, causing a different mix of firms to enter the area and replace the retail spending of outgoing hybrid and remote office workers. That same report went on to say the cost of living in Boston and Cambridge may improve somewhat if the shift away from urban areas actually occurs and relieves some of today's pressure and density. Monica Tibbits-Nutt, I want to ask you about another piece of that report. You've talked about how working differently, working the way a lot of us, but not all of us, have been working right now, can create equity or offer advantages, maybe to work-life balance that we didn't have before. But that same Baker administration report highlighted the fact that the benefits of hybrid or remote work are not equally dispersed among the population. Specifically, there are some big racial discrepancies. The report said, quote, a significant portion of some populations has not been able to work remotely during the pandemic. Before COVID-19, only about 20% of African Americans and 16% of Hispanic and Latino workers worked in jobs that allowed them to work remotely, compared to about 30% of white workers and 37% of Asian American workers. Monica, are you at all concerned that if we keep the new normal to a large extent, that some groups of people are going to be left behind and not enjoy benefits that others of us do?
It's a huge concern. And I think looking at the statistics, it really does point out there are many jobs and oftentimes lower paying jobs that just cannot be done remotely. And I think that is really, really tough, and really trying to understand how we better support those populations. And are there other shifts that we can make? I think one of the other things that was pointed out and what you were talking about is looking at the options for people to live different places than they are currently, living in places that are significantly more affordable because now they're not commuting in. And that's before you even think about the transportation impacts. But I do think that trying to figure out how we are going to deal with this as far as those jobs that have to be in person and what sort of additional benefits and incentives and safety nets that we can put in for those populations, I think is going to be one of the more difficult questions we answer, because the new normal does not deal with that at all.
If you two are willing, this won't be the final question, but I'm interested in just how each of you, if you're willing to share, feel about the way we've been working at this point in time. And I will start by saying I have loved a whole bunch of things about working primarily from home. I've loved not having a commute that was driving me crazy. I've loved having more time to spend with my family, more time to exercise, stuff like that. As you said, Monica, there's the additional benefit, which isn't usually front of mind for me, of, okay, now I have driven in because public transit doesn't work for me. Now I'm not polluting the way I used to be. That being said, I also feel like I've hit this point a couple of years into the pandemic where I am actually thrilled that GBH is pulling people back, because I feel like I didn't need it for a long time, and now I kind of do, at least 2 or 3 days a week. Are either of you willing to share how you're feeling personally at this point in time?
I mean, I think similar to you. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Shirley.
Go ahead, Monica. Go ahead.
I mean, I think similar to you, my life has changed and my family's life has changed to a benefit. I have a small child, and a lot of times, rushing home to pick her up from school, then doing laundry until 10 or 11 o'clock at night, doing this every day. It was just miserable. And the other thing is, I was shopping for a house in the middle of a pandemic. All of the homes in the inner core, incredibly expensive, definitely outside of my family's means. And so now we were able to move further out because now we're not having to commute in as long. And it just gives you more time also to work the hours that work best for you. And that has been the biggest thing for my staff is some of them work better at night. Some of them work better in the mornings. And we have been able to craft schedules that work for everyone. With that said, I miss seeing my teammates. I miss seeing my colleagues. And for us coming in 1 to 2 days a week where everyone is in the office, obviously space has been huge for us. We get that interaction, but at the same time, we're still able to live a much higher quality of life than we were able to before. And I think, when we talk about work-life balance, this is the first time that I think a lot of us have been able to implement a lot of those strategies. And now we've gotten so used to it that I do think it calls into question the traditional 9-to-5 workplace. And does that actually work for everyone?
Shirley, you get the last word here.
I have to say, I feel everything both of you have felt, right, during this pandemic. I have to say right now, the past month, I've been going into the office more, right? And once or twice a week or downtown once or twice a week. And I have to say, it's a huge adjustment. I don't know if you felt that way too, but it's a huge adjustment. I have to rethink about, what does it mean to be in the office? When I'm in the office now, I catch up with colleagues, I'm having lunch with sources. I actually get none of my own work done. And so I have to think about work differently when I'm in the office now versus working from home. And so I think that's the period we're entering, a huge adjustment, a huge transition for everyone. And we're going to have good days and bad days.
I'm glad you said that, because there are times I almost feel like I'm relearning some basic skills that I took for granted for 5 decades. So Shirley Leung, Monica Tibbits-Nutt, thank you both. That's it for tonight, but do come back next week. Candidate for Governor Sonia Chang Diaz will join me to talk about her pitch to voters and what a path to victory in the Democratic primary could look like, with Maura Healey ahead in the polls. As always, please tell us what you think. The email is talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics. Or you can find me on Twitter. I'm @ReillyAdam. For now, thanks for watching and good night.